Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Muwaffa Harb. I am the moderator of today's session about what did we learn from COVID-19 to Ukraine, to the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the gradual pulling out from Mali, and I'm sure we do have a lot of other issues that some of the guests would love to address. And at the end of the session, I would open the floor for question and answers, so also your questions are welcome. We do have today great panel. The organizer assembled great speakers. Every one of them has an impressive resume and a biography. I will not read it because it will take all of our session. And I'm going to ask each one of the panelists to speak for 3 to 5 minutes. And then, if anyone from the panelists would like to intervene, make a remark, question, rebuttal, they will be welcome to do that. But I would ask each one of them to be precise about their presentation, 3 to 5 minutes, because we have 6 guests and we don't have a lot of time, and I want to open the floor to the audience to ask some of the questions. My name is Muwaffa Harb. Those who attended previous editions of MEDays have seen me before. I'm a journalist. I grew up in Washington. I was born in Lebanon, and I worked for American television. I did Al Hurra Radio Sawa, and I'm a journalist. So regardless of the function of my job today, basically I'm a journalist. So what does it mean? I'm going to be precise. I'm going to go straight to the point, and I will be looking for some inconsistency of what the guest may say, that I will exercise my authority to stop them, but I am sure they will be strict in following the rules and the regulations of the organizers. The questions we are going to address today, I think most of you would be interested in hearing, and I'm glad you could join us today. They don't sound like very complicated. What can we learn from the latest major events on the international scene? What are the new lines of force that structure the international scene? How to strengthen the resilience of the international system in the face of global crisis and geopolitical disruptions? How can we rethink international cooperation and integrate as many actors as possible in order to promote concerted action on a global scale to deal with the ongoing crisis? Where do the countries of the Global South stand in this paradigm shift? I will ask, these are the parameters of our discussion today, but I am sure we will be drifting to some other issues of interest. And so I will cut my comments and go straight to the point and introduce our first speaker today. He is His Excellency, Monsieur André Flahault. He's the Minister of State, Kingdom of Belgium. His expertise varies from politics to defense to he's a seasoned diplomat, and I will not go over his biography because it will take the whole time of today's session. So please allow me to welcome Mr. André Flahault. S'il vous plaît, monsieur.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Bonjour à toutes et à tous, et merci pour cette assemblée. Alors, comme j'étais à un certain moment président de l'Assemblée parlementaire en Belgique, je sais le rôle ingrat que joue l'animateur qui doit faire respecter les temps de parole. Donc, je vais essayer de donner l'exemple, et nous avons reçu effectivement une série de questions sur le contexte international. Je crois que les analyses concluent toutes à le fait que nous sommes aujourd'hui dans une période de crise tout à fait neuve, après la crise sanitaire, la crise alimentaire et les guerres qui commencent à fleurir un peu partout dans le monde. Et il y a aussi toutes ces guerres oubliées, tous ces conflits oubliés auxquels on aurait peut-être intérêt à s'intéresser un peu plus dans l'intérêt des populations. Alors je vais m'efforcer, dans le temps qui m'est imparti, de répondre aux questions que vous avez posées. Alors, qu'est-ce qu'il faut retenir? Que faut-il retenir des derniers éléments majeurs de la scène internationale? Il y a une seule chose à retenir, c'est que sur la scène internationale, c'est le désordre le plus complet aujourd'hui. Il n'y a absolument plus de ligne de conduite, il n'y a absolument plus de vision claire de ce que l'on voudrait. Et au grand drame, on ne parle pas beaucoup, ni en tout cas on parle insuffisamment de la paix et de développement et de l'humain. Certes, aujourd'hui, les conflits créent des drames auprès des populations civiles partout dans le monde, de part et d'autre des belligérants, des pays belligérants, mais finalement, ceux qui tirent profit de ces situations aujourd'hui, ce sont les fabricants d'armes, où qu'ils se trouvent. Et ça doit être notre préoccupation à nous, qui sommes politiques et qui devons prendre nos responsabilités. L'autre élément, quelles sont les nouvelles lignes de force qui structurent la scène internationale? Mon sentiment, c'est que l'ONU aujourd'hui démontre son incapacité totale à régler les problèmes. Elle est paralysée dans sa décision, dans sa prise de décision. Et puis quelque part aussi, l'ONU, est-ce qu'il représente encore la réalité de notre planète? Puisque finalement, on ignore un continent entier. Le continent africain n'est pas à la table de l'ONU pour intervenir. Et pourtant, Dieu sait si l'avenir de la planète dépend beaucoup de ce qui se passera en Afrique et des richesses de l'Afrique. Mais aujourd'hui, les richesses, elles sont exploitées par les Occidentaux. Les Occidentaux qui se font la guerre entre eux. Je reviens du Congo, je reviens d'autres pays où effectivement, on nous dit de façon globale que ce n'est pas la guerre de l'Afrique, c'est la guerre des Occidentaux. Et on veut pénaliser quelque part aussi les Africains parce qu'ils ne suivent pas la ligne que l'on voudrait faire suivre au nord, les nordistes. Et là, je crois que nous avons une grande réflexion à avoir et à rétablir un équilibre aussi au niveau de la scène internationale. Comment se renforcer? Il faut effectivement redéfinir l'ensemble des lignes. Il faut remettre autour de la table tous les acteurs et ne pas se comporter comme nous nous comportons souvent, nous, comme Européens et comme Occidentaux, et je parle à l'aise. Je suis au cœur de l'Europe. Bruxelles, la capitale de l'Europe. L'Europe dont on peut s'interroger aujourd'hui, si elle a encore véritablement une existence et une cohérence. Elle agit en ordre dispersé, selon que l'on se trouve au nord de l'Europe, selon que l'on se trouve à proximité de la Russie, selon que l'on se trouve au centre ou au sud. Les sudistes sont préoccupés par la migration, ceux du nord sont préoccupés par les problèmes aussi de migration, mais aussi de leur proximité avec la Russie. Et au centre, les pays fondateurs se cherchent et quelquefois l'Allemagne et la France se querellent quant à la définition des lignes de politique et des lignes de cohérence à obtenir. Et donc, oui, l'acteur européen est déstructuré avec ce qui se passe aujourd'hui. Et que se retrouve-t-on aujourd'hui? Des blocs qui s'affrontent entre eux. Et finalement, oui, il y a les États-Unis d'un côté, qui effectivement, au travers de l'OTAN, dont ils ont pris la maîtrise totale de l'OTAN. J'ai été pendant 8 ans et demi ministre de la Défense en Belgique. J'étais un des porteurs de la défense européenne. J'étais celui, avec mon collègue des Affaires étrangères de l'époque, qui était le père du président du Conseil européen aujourd'hui, à dire non à la participation à la guerre en Irak. À cette époque-là, on avait encore le courage de dire non à certaines choses. Aujourd'hui, on ne dit plus non, on suit le mouvement et on entre dans une guerre dont on sait, comme toutes les guerres, quand elles commencent, mais on ne sait pas quand elles vont finir. Parce que ce soit pour l'Afghanistan, pour l'Irak, pour la Libye, pour le Kosovo, à chaque fois, on a décidé des conflits sans prévoir des sorties. Et on a alors des catastrophes. On a des catastrophes avec l'Afghanistan, 20 ans après le retour des talibans. On a les catastrophes d'instabilité au niveau du Kosovo. On a des catastrophes avec la Libye, qui était la digue ouverte pour toutes les armes et tout ce que l'on retrouve aujourd'hui, au niveau du Mali par exemple, où là la France, finalement, a raté. Et elle a raté aussi parce que finalement, nous avons un grand défaut dans notre approche de l'Afrique et dans notre approche des autres pays du monde entier, c'est la transposition des modèles. Nous pensons que parce que nous avons, nous, un modèle de développement qui, soi-disant, a fait leurs preuves, nous pouvons l'imposer à d'autres sans nécessairement tenir compte suffisamment suffisamment de ce sont les préoccupations, les sensibilités, qu'elles soient religieuses, économiques, de culture des peuples où on se trouve. On ne pourra réussir que si demain on reconstruit à partir de la base, à partir des populations, en respectant les uns et les autres, plutôt que dans la définition de grandes stratégies qui ont démontré aujourd'hui leur échec, puisque que ce soit pour le Covid, que ce soit pour la crise alimentaire, on voit bien qu'on ne trouve pas de solution au plan global et c'est le bilatéral qui se crée. Et en ce qui concerne le dernier élément, c'est la place du Grand Sud, je l'ai dit en commençant, je crois qu'effectivement, il est grand temps que l'Afrique se réveille, qu'elle coordonne ses actions, que finalement, elle soit aussi capable de faire apparaître que les conflits, que ce soit entre aujourd'hui à l'est du Congo, dont on parle très peu, dans l'opinion publique, dans les médias, on parle très peu de ça. En Belgique, par exemple, et en Europe, chaque jour, on parle de la guerre en Ukraine, mais on ne parle pas de la guerre au Congo. Chaque jour, on parle de la guerre en Ukraine, mais ça fait des années qu'on ne parle plus du drame vécu par les Palestiniens, qui sont un peuple maltraité, dont on ne respecte pas l'intégrité du territoire. On ne veut pas leur donner un territoire. Et là, notre communauté internationale est muette. L'ONU est muette. Les rapports qui sont quelquefois accablants, à l'égard, par exemple, de l'assassinat de la journaliste, quand il y a un assassinat d'une journaliste dans un pays de l'Europe ou ailleurs, on fait beaucoup d'articles, on fait beaucoup de commentaires. Quand on assassine une journaliste en Palestine, que la preuve est donnée, que ce sont des armes, des balles palestiniennes qui ont tué, on en parle très peu. Et ça, on ne construit pas un monde, on ne reconstruit pas un monde après les crises que nous avons vécues sur de tels déséquilibres ou de telles orientations dans la communication qui est totalement inobjectivée, si vous me passez l'expression, à cause effectivement des fake news et du développement, je m'excuse pour le journaliste qui est là, des réseaux sociaux. Voilà, c'est tout ce que je voulais vous dire, en essayant d'avoir été très court. Je ne sais pas si j'ai respecté le temps de parole, mais en tout cas, j'ai fait un effort, parce qu'en politique, ce qui est important, ce n'est pas seulement de faire des promesses, c'est de les tenir et d'agir concrètement. Je vous remercie.
Merci. Thank you, Mr. Flau. I think it makes a natural progress to move into Mr. Bill Ramel. He's a former member of Parliament, and he served in the, I think, the Foreign Office as a senior minister, and at the same, also he served in the Ministry of Defense. Currently, he serves as the president of Zoom in the UK. Most speakers are encouraged to speak between 3 to 5 minutes. He's only allowed 1 minute because he's a Spurs fan. I'm an Arsenal fan, so so please.
Thank you, Monsieur le Moderateur, and remembering the need for brevity, which you've charged us with, I'll try to remember something that the poet, British poet Shelley once said about a former politician, that he had lost the ability to think, but unfortunately not the power of speech, which is a thought that comes back to me from time to time. But I'd like to start by gently challenging the premise of this panel discussion, that the last 2 years with COVID, Ukraine, Afghanistan and Mali has been unprecedented. There have been previous periods of profound international turbulence which have impacted economically throughout the globe. The 1973 oil crisis, Afghanistan and Iraq after 9/11, the Cold War, the Spanish flu pandemic, to name just 4. But certainly the last 2 years have been disruptive and destabilizing. Covid-19 brought disease and economic disruption on an unprecedented scale. It gave a taste, and we need to remember this, of what may yet be to come with future pandemics. And it brought home, I think, the lack of disaster preparedness across governments across the world. It questioned and challenged our ability to function normally as societies, but it did bring concerted government intervention, economic intervention, to protect people and livelihoods, certainly in the advanced world. And it brought about international cooperation over vaccine sharing, although not quickly enough. And it underlined critically our interdependence in the face of a global pandemic. None of us is safe until all of us are safe. Ukraine Russia's aggression against a peaceful neighbour has been barbaric and taken us back, I think, to much, much darker times. And Putin's rhetoric is becoming increasingly irresponsible, referring to the use of nuclear weapons and making dangerous fabrications around a so-called dirty bomb. Some of the Russian attacks have been conducted using Iranian-supplied drones, underlining the deeply malign and nefarious engagement of Iran in conflicts throughout the globe. Most recently, we've seen Russia engage in baseless, ridiculous assertions that the UK was involved in the destruction of part of the Nord Stream pipeline. And Putin has disastrously and unjustifiably pulled out of the UN-backed agreement on grain exports, which have been vital in reducing global food prices. And he's engaged in a black propaganda war with lies and fabrications to justify the unjustifiable. In Afghanistan, a country that I visited 5 times as a UK minister, we have seen real progress thrown into reverse. The international coalition was right, I think, to intervene after 9/11. The Taliban was housing terrorist training camps, which posed a real threat to the international community. After that intervention, real progress was made economically, socially, politically, and particularly in the field of women's rights. It's worth remembering that under the Taliban, there were no medical services available to women, but by 2018, over 3,000 functional health facilities, giving 87% of Afghan people access to a medical facility within a 2-hour distance. In 2003, fewer than 10% of girls in primary schools. By 2017, that had grown to 33%. Women's life expectancy increased by 10 years. Real, tangible progress that I regret to say was put at risk by the abandonment of Afghanistan by the coalition and the allowance of the return of the Taliban. And a retreat, and I regret to say this, into isolation by the US, disgracefully started by Donald Trump and sadly followed through by Joe Biden. In Mali, we've seen further malign involvement by Russia. The junta, which came to power through the coup, has made practical decisions to align with Russia and Wagner, a Russian-backed company. Incidents of terror are increasing and there are significant human rights abuses. Everyone throughout the planet has been affected by all of this and there are significant concerns. And that has led to the resulting global upheavals. We need, in response to all of that, a coordinated international response, diplomatically, socially, economically, and where necessary and appropriately, militarily. And I think there are fledgling grounds for optimism. Russia in Ukraine and elsewhere has met with much greater NATO unity and international support than expected. Heroic resistance by Ukraine has repelled Russia. Last month at the United Nations, more countries than ever voted to condemn Russia for its illegal and unjustifiable annexation of Ukrainian territory. Effective, coordinated sanctions against Russia have been put in place, and they need to follow through against Iran. And we need to sustain and grow that diplomatic coalition against Putin. In Afghanistan, it has been awful, but we need coordinated pressure on the Taliban to protect the progress that has been made. And the opposition to and revulsion against the US and coalition withdrawal means that I think similar such regressive withdrawal in, for example, Iraq, which I think would be very retrograde, is much less likely to take place. We've come through COVID, but we need greater international cooperation to be reinforced. And we desperately need, and this is the point I'll finish with, the kind of global economic coordination in response to all that has happened, like that which we achieved in the banking crisis back in 2008. And we have to push and use statecraft and diplomacy to work together and see the interdependence which affects us all. In that regard, the recent short-sighted decision by OPEC Plus to cut production quotas whilst the global economy is dealing with the continued negative impact of Putin's invasion of Ukraine very much comes to mind here. And as Joe Biden has argued rightly, we need to look for additional tools and authorities to reduce OPEC's control over energy prices. And that has to be an international effort. And as my previous ministerial colleague has said, we need reform and reinvigoration of the United Nations. We've been talking about it for so long, but we haven't created the conditions to enable that to take place, and it very much is needed now. And through all of that, we need to argue, push, and assert the interests of the global south, which has been ignored for far too long.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ramel. Before I ask our next speaker, Mr. Mustafa Kamal Kazi, I have a quick question for both of you, Mr. Flau or Mr. Ramel. Have we learned anything? Meaning, when I say we in the West, do you see eye to eye following COVID and now the aggression against the Ukraine? Are the Western countries aligned in approaching and tackling issues? And I'm talking European, following Brexit, following the crisis in Ukraine right now, and the energy crisis, and what we have seen during the COVID, the pandemic. Do you guys see eye to eye nowadays? Where does Europe stand on these issues nowadays? And I would ask Monsieur Flau to give me quick remarks regarding this, and then you, Mr. Ramel.
L'Europe aujourd'hui, elle se cherche. Elle se cherche et elle n'apporte pas de réponse cohérente. Quand il y a eu, pendant la période où la Grande-Bretagne était dans l'Europe, c'était très difficile, par exemple, de définir une vision européenne de la politique de la défense. C'était constaté. On voulait mettre en place des politiques d'acquisition de matériel, des politiques de réaction coordonnées. On avait chaque fois des freins. Tout simplement parce que il y a cette double entité. Il y a l'OTAN, il y a l'Europe. Et quelque part, dans l'OTAN, il y a les États-Unis qui sont très, 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 très puissants. That's the reality, sorry. Et de plus en plus puissants. Et au niveau de la guerre en Ukraine maintenant, c'est clair que l'Europe de la défense a perdu toute perspective d'exister, puisqu'on a renforcé la politique de l'OTAN. C'est aujourd'hui l'OTAN qui se positionne, c'est l'OTAN qui organise, c'est l'OTAN qui... Et on suit, effectivement, on va acheter du matériel, et quand on dit qu'on va acheter du matériel en Europe, ce n'est pas possible. Tout simplement parce que nous n'avons pas réellement une industrie de la défense au niveau européen. Les Allemands et les Français ne s'entendent pas. La preuve, c'est que les Allemands viennent d'acheter 100 F-35, qui est l'avion promu par les États-Unis. Et ce n'est pas nécessairement le meilleur avion. La Belgique en a acheté aussi. Et d'autres en achètent. Les Suisses en achètent aussi. Donc, quelque part, comment voulez-vous après justifier l'existence d'une Europe de la défense quand la cellule informatique de vos avions de combat seront toujours aux mains des États-Unis? Alors, bon, écoutez, moi je veux bien, mais on ne va pas se leurrer. La réalité aujourd'hui, c'est de voir comment nous pouvons, au sein de cette OTAN, ne pas en sortir, parce que c'est impossible, il faut être pragmatique, mais comment au sein mieux se faire respecter et tenir compte de nos spécificités du Parlement, du continent européen, et aussi dans la relation avec le Sud. Parce que ce qui est l'avenir de l'Europe, c'est, à mon sens, l'axe de solidarité nord-sud et sud-nord qui n'aurait jamais dû être détruit ou qui n'aurait jamais dû être mis en cause, mais finalement, c'est cette solidarité avec le continent africain et dans le respect mutuel des peuples, et pas uniquement avec une Europe qui joue son rôle de forteresse aujourd'hui, avec la préoccupation première, c'est de laisser de l'autre côté de la Méditerranée des migrants qui ne nous intéressent pas, et à certains endroits, certains pays revendent leurs migrants à certains pays africains. C'est le cas du Danemark et c'est le cas notamment de la Grande-Bretagne, ce qui, sur le plan humain, est totalement inacceptable et intolérable.
Merci, monsieur. Mr. Ramel, please.
I respond to your question as a passionate pro-European, and I'm interpreting... Sorry, I respond to your question as a passionate pro-European, and I interpret the underlying thrust of your question of has Europe been undermined by Brexit? And I think it has, and the United Kingdom has. I think Brexit was the biggest act of self-harm that the UK has inflicted upon itself in generations and generations. We are, however, where we are, and politically I think it's really important that the UK constructs a relationship with the countries of the European Union as partners to face up to the challenge, the existential challenges that we face in Ukraine and elsewhere. On the positive side, I would say, if you look at Ukraine as the example and what Putin has done, some of the unjustifiable reasons he used to support what he was doing was a perceived threat from NATO. In fact, his actions have reinvigorated and brought NATO together as it has not been in the previous decades, and there's much greater unity, and I think Europe is at the heart of that. And I think that is a very positive force. And the fact that countries like Sweden and Finland have been prompted to join NATO, I think has been a positive development as well. But we need to work at it as Europeans together.
Thank you, thank you. Monsieur Flau, vous avez des remarques?
Juste une petite... D'abord, je voudrais préciser que je ne défends aucun dictateur. Je ne défendais pas Kadhafi, je ne défendais pas Saddam Hussein, je ne défends pas Poutine. On condamne, comme mon gouvernement, avec la plus grande fermeté, l'invasion d'un pays par un autre, et en ne respectant pas les règles du droit international. Que les choses soient bien claires. Mais il faut être aussi précis et ne pas dire des contre-vérités. Parce que lorsque l'on dit que la Russie est arrivée aux portes de l'OTAN, c'est une contre-vérité. C'est une contre-vérité parce que quand la chute du mur de Berlin est intervenue, après cela, c'est l'OTAN qui s'est élargie progressivement vers la Russie. Et j'étais ministre de la Défense en 2000. J'ai fait à l'époque, parce que nous allions avoir la présidence de l'Union européenne, j'ai fait le tour de tous les pays candidats à l'ouverture à l'OTAN et à l'ouverture à l'Europe. Ma question était à chacun des collègues ministres, quelle est votre priorité? Et la réponse était NATO, NATO, NATO. L'Europe, ça venait dans un deuxième temps. Et donc, la vérité, c'est que d'élargissement en élargissement, notamment sous la pression du président Bush, eh bien, on a effectivement élargi l'Europe, qui est maintenant aux portes de la Russie. On a élargi l'Europe et l'OTAN aux portes de la Russie. C'est contraire à tout ce qui a été dit, et il y a des accords qui avaient été passés avec M. Gorbatchev qui n'ont pas été respectés. C'est dramatique, ça arrive à la situation à laquelle nous assistons aujourd'hui, mais quand on veut faire une lecture des événements tels qu'ils se présentent, il faut avoir la lecture la plus complète possible, et les journalistes doivent effectivement vérifier leurs sources et s'assurer que les informations soient à la fois à charge et à décharge de part et d'autre.
Thank you, thank you. Our next speaker is His Excellency Mr. Mustafa Kamal Kazi. He's the former Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs from the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. He's contributed to many think tanks and a regular guest and a friend of Amadeus at MEDays. Thank you very much, please.
Thank you very much. I must first of all compliment Institut Amadeus and its dynamic president, Mr. Fassi Ferry, for carrying forward decade-and-a-half quest for bridge building and promoting global understanding for peace. The MEDays Forum provides excellent opportunity for much-needed frank and open dialogue on issues confronting the world and more particularly Global South. Coming to our topic, I must say sadly that no lessons have been learned, whether it is COVID-19, Ukraine, Afghanistan, or Mali. In fact, we seem to be bent upon repeating past mistakes, disregarding principles of peaceful coexistence. Let's take COVID. As soon as first reports about the outbreak of COVID-19 came up, not only political, but racial prejudices came into play. Instead of teaming up to deal with it, all kinds of blame was put on China, which reported initial outbreak. The pandemic exposed limitations of WHO. It even exposed limitations of rich and developed countries to respond to crises that they had every reason to anticipate. No credible, objective, global investigation has been launched to exclude unwelcome intrusion of large-scale biogenetic experiments or doings of powerful pharma industry. According to the very recent reports, Boston University has developed a far more deadlier strain than COVID-19. The program was partially funded by the National Institute of Health of USA. America has funded many such laboratories in different countries. Such researches need to be brought under WHO or any other international monitoring mechanism. Coming to Ukraine and Afghanistan, I'll take Ukraine and Afghanistan together because there is some resemblance between the two. Afghanistan was a proxy war, Ukraine also. But in substance and nature, Ukraine conflict is far more dangerous. This conflict has brought the world to the brink of nuclear Armageddon and caused serious global economic consequences for both rich and poor countries. There is no doubt that Russian military action in Ukraine is in total breach of UN Charter and international law. This 9 months war has caused widespread destruction and humanitarian calamity of tragic proportions. It must be brought to an end sooner the better. Sadly, no lessons have been learned from what happened in Afghanistan in 1979, when Soviet Union invaded it and the tragic aftermath for that unfortunate country. 41 years back, my country, Pakistan, joined the last and decisive battle of Cold War in Afghanistan. We generally saw it as a brutal aggression by a large and powerful neighbor. We acted to support our Afghan brothers. But were we right? I wonder today. Because the conflict soon developed into a proxy war between two powers of that time. Thanks to Mr. Brzezinski, President Carter's national security advisor, who confessed that it was Washington which actually planned and worked to lure, I quote his words, to lure the Russians into Afghan trap, unquote. In an interview in 1997, Brzezinski goes on to claim, and I quote him, "The day the Soviets officially crossed the border, I wrote to the President Carter, and I quote him again, we now have an opportunity of giving to the USSR its Vietnam, unquote. According to him, they had started luring much before the Soviet invasion. But Mr. Brzezinski's advice subsequently produced Bin Laden, Taliban, and events leading to 9/11. Also, Washington's own invasion and occupation of Afghanistan and subsequently humiliating withdrawal. Despite trillions of dollars spent, devastated Afghans are living closer to Stone Age now. And we in Pakistan continue to pay the price for our role in that proxy war. Soviet Union is no more. There are many harsh lessons for hardliners on all sides of Ukraine war. The way normally invasion of a small country by a large country, a larger neighbor, is something that enjoys, the support, the condemnation of the entire international community. But sadly, in this case, it has not been so.
One more minute, Mr. Kazi. 1 more minute, please.
Pardon?
1 more minute, please.
1 more minute. Okay, yeah. So Russia is the largest country in Europe, not only in Europe, but in the world. It has centuries-old history as a key war and peace player in Europe, Europe and Asia, with nearly 6,000 nuclear warheads and enormous natural resources. Does it make any sense to exclude Russia from any regional or global security architecture? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Ramel, I think you do have an intervention to make. Quick one, please.
Just a brief pushback to my friend, His Excellency. If I understood your remarks at the beginning, and I'm not, an unalloyed supporter always of the United States, but you appeared to absolve China of a lack of openness at the outbreak of COVID, which I think was one of the fundamental problems of what took place. And then the unverified statements about US research, you said all such research should take place under the auspices of the WHO. One, that would be impossible. Two, I think it's inconsistent with the rights of national self-determination and national sovereignty to pursue scientific research. And you asked for it to be overseen by the WHO, which didn't and couldn't give a lead at the outbreak of COVID. I don't think that is a credible way forward, with respect.
Thank you. Thank you. Please, quick remark.
Exactly. This has been the failure of international community, all countries of the world, because there is so much of political polarization that they can't dispassionately team together to look at the problems and to find their solutions, because these solutions can't be found by one country or the other country. This is an international obligation on the entire international community. Now, the reason, this is something that I already mentioned, that why this has not been investigated. How did the outbreak take place? There has been instead of name-calling and blaming, there should have been objective inquiry, a dispassionate inquiry, not aimed to sort of stigmatize one particular country, and there should be a neutrality and impartiality in making such investigations. There's a pharma industry which has very ambitious financial targets to achieve, and there is a big research that's going on in different spheres, and this needs to be under control. Why WHO has not been up to the mark? It is us, the member states, who make an international organization stronger or weaker.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is His Excellency, Mr. Yakis Yassar. He's the former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Republic of Turkey. Please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The organizers of this meeting have put very clear-cut questions, and I will try to be as brief as possible to address them. Let me begin by commenting on the COVID-19. To begin with COVID-19, the international community faced one of the deadliest challenges in the history. As of 15th of October 2002, the pandemic had caused more than 624 million cases and 6.5 million people passed away because of COVID. The COVID vaccine prevented an additional of 14.4 to 19.8 million deaths in 185 countries and territories from as of the 7th of December 2020 to December 21. We learned how interdependent we were both in positive and negative senses. The degree of contagion was very high. The international trips were the main factor for the quick spread of pandemics. There were sudden fall in the number of flights and in the number of passengers. We learned the importance of mutual assistance and its shortcomings. We learned the shortcomings of the WHO. We learned the effects of the lock-ins and how it negatively affected the psychology of millions. New habits evolved and new shopping habits also were invented. Remote education is tested. The telemeetings have become widespread and technological infrastructure quickly adapted itself to the new requirement. The conspiracy theories, of course, still abound on the causes and consequences on side effects. Whether they are true or not, I will not comment on it. Now I move to the difficult question of Ukraine. Russia continued its method of annexing with impunity parts of the former Soviet territories to the Russian Federation. It started with Crimea, then it annexed South Ossetia. Now Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and the Zaporizhia provinces are also being annexed. I mean, the public opinion polls are being carried, and it is in the process of being annexed. A military confrontation by proxy is going on between NATO, and perhaps more specifically with the US, and the Russian Federation. The basic philosophy of the US is to weaken Russia. There are disgruntling voices from certain NATO countries, but so far these voices are at the controllable level. Russia may have miscalculated the reaction of NATO countries. When I say NATO countries, I mean United States. The US defense industry lobby must be playing a very important role behind the scenes. Russia has means to cause extensive damage to Ukraine's military power and to the civilian infrastructure. If the destruction of the military targets continue growing, Russia has means to cause more damage to Ukraine. Whether it ends up with using of tactical nuclear weapons cannot be told at this stage, but such a scenario cannot be discarded entirely. An escalation beyond exchange of tactical missiles is less likely because it may escalate to full-fledged nuclear confrontation, and this will be a calamity. Militarily, NATO is of course a stronger bloc than Russia, but if Russia feels cornered, it may resort to massive retaliation, and there will be no winner in such a confrontation. Regarding Afghanistan, our colleagues commented extensively on it. The sudden withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan was a mistake. Doing it without consulting the allies was another mistake. It caused an erosion in the reliability of the United States. Taliban did not smoothen almost none of its strict and outdated practices. The international community wants to help Afghanistan, but Afghanistan seems set to continue its former practices. On Mali, the withdrawal of the French forces Barkhane from Mali will probably increase the threat of the fundamentalism in the sub-Saharan countries. Sub-Saharan Africa, all the way from Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, north of Togo, Benin, may slowly fall under the influence of radicalism, with all incalculable consequences. Malian public seems to have grown unhappy by the presence of the French troops. Military solutions are appropriate for urgent solutions, but radicalism is a deep-rooted phenomenon. it can be eliminated through long-term programs that cover decades. Otherwise, Sub-Sahara will continue to be a safe haven for fundamentalists, and if they are not uprooted, they may threaten European capitals as well in the long run. Longer-term development programs are needed for Sub-Saharan Africa and for the eradication of the fundamentalism. On the other hand, if Wagner mercenaries of Russia settle in this difficult geography, military balance in the region may change against the West in the long run. On the question of what are the new lines of force that structure the international scene, I would like to say that the new power balance in Europe and even in the world at large will be shaped by the defense structure of Europe. Germany, and to a lesser degree France, will emerge as the major actors in the European part of the Euro-Atlantic community. The UK will probably, His Excellency, our British colleague, has commented very brilliantly on this question. UK has always played the role of moderator between two European powers, Germany and France. The US will use the Ukrainian crisis to weaken Russia, perhaps at the expense of the Ukrainian people. The final outcome of the crisis is still uncertain, in my opinion, despite all the hopeful things that Russia will lose the battle.
Mr. Yassar, time to conclude, please.
Yes, I am concluding in 1 minute. We usually presume that the global crisis and geological disruption may weaken the international system. This is true in certain circumstances. However, global crisis and geopolitical disruption may, on the contrary, contribute to the strengthening of the resilience of the international system without an outside intervention. More often than not, the global crisis create also their own solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Before I ask Dr. Vidin to address the audience, please, I urge the remaining speakers, if there's any idea that you find that's duplicate, skip it. Let's keep the conversation rich and let's try to cover as many ideas as possible. And I urge you to challenge if there's any other idea that you want to remark. And if there is any agreement, please say it after the panel. Don't agree. And Dr. Vidin, she is with the Swedish International Affairs Institute.
Right. Okay. So I'd like to thank the organizers of the Amadeus Institute for inviting me here. This is my third time here in Tanger. I enjoy it. It's really nice to be back. I'm going to put on my historian hat and my linguistics hat and focus on the world relations, international relations. What is that? So my argument is that we cannot strengthen the resilience of the national system without rethinking international cooperation, and concerted action on a global scale cannot happen if countries don't change how they relate to each other. The COVID-19 pandemic is a case in point. Underplaying the truly global nature of the pandemic, rich countries in the West focus primarily on their own populations, leaving poorer countries to fend for themselves. There were global efforts to sponsor vaccination programs, but these were often undercut by rich countries buying massive amounts of vaccine, leaving poorer countries short. At the same time, and here I am in agreement with some people, I will say it anyway, it is clear that the Western-centric word system is fundamentally flawed and increasingly sidestepped by competitors which seek new alignments outside of the system. And a case in point, which has relevance to the conflict in Ukraine in particular, is Saudi Arabia, which is challenging the United States' notion of the kingdom as a client state without a proper national interest independent from Washington. Saudi foreign policy behavior and geopolitical stance is closely connected to its socio-economic reform program referred to as Vision 2030. And regarding the war in Ukraine and the related energy crisis more specifically, we see Saudi Arabia maintaining close cooperation with Russia to maintain the oil price at a sufficiently high level to allow the kingdom to continue to pursue its economic diversification policy. Long-term regime stability in Saudi Arabia and Mohammed bin Salman's own future is dependent on the degree of success of the 2030 vision. So while states' national interests often interfere with each other, states can nevertheless choose to demonstrate a deeper understanding and respect for each other's goals and aspirations. The likelihood that there could be concerted dialogue and deeper and wider collaboration is greater if states treat each other as equals. Even extremely thorny issues such as human rights and energy security could then be addressed in a more productive manner. I'd also like to say that countries such as Russia and Iran are other cases where Western powers have failed to acknowledge the aspirations and self-image of these countries and their leaders, which has made their behavior much more aggressive. It's not a matter of validating violent behavior and aggression, but rather that these countries' concerns and aspirations should be taken into consideration, that there should be a serious effort to understand these. Similarly, we can say about France's involvement in Mali, where French actors in many cases have promoted their own interests before those of Mali's or its neighbors, which create resentment and does not allow to correctly deal with root causes that have led to insecurity. And regarding the US departure from Afghanistan, it's fair to pose the question, what exactly was the purpose of the long-term US military intervention there in the first place? And what was actually achieved? It seems obvious, at least to me, that the rationale for the intervention changed over time to state building, which eventually failed. US interest and Western overall interest failed to look at what was best for Afghanistan and demonstrated great ignorance of the tribal composition and trans-border connections. Achievements in terms of improved human rights, women's rights and human rights now seem largely lost. So in conclusion, I'd like to note that Western countries have demonstrated a great deal of hubris and ruthlessness regarding the capabilities in Afghanistan, Ukraine, and Mali, and regarding the management of the Covid-19 pandemic. These policies are now backfiring by creating big fractures in the national system, and those fractures have been evident for a long, long time, but have become even wider with the recent developments. So I'd like to stop there.
Thank you very much. Before I ask Mr. Sanderson to speak, I have a quick question for you. You touched upon the issue of Ukraine and Saudi Arabia and Arab Gulf states. How would you characterize and how would you explain the current attitudes of Gulf states towards the Russian-Ukrainian war?
Yes, and of course that's their positioning seems very difficult to understand, especially from a Western perspective. And if you talk from a US perspective, I would like to say that I see their policies being explained by their interest, self-interest to carry out the diversification projects, their economic diversification projects. And if we talk about Saudi Arabia specifically, the 2030 vision is a very large project, and it has to do inherently with regime stability. So being able to continue to inject money into the investments, making it...
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yes.
How would give the impression being siding with Ukraine helps stability? You're trying to make a link between stability and the current attitude towards the war in Ukraine. Can you please elaborate on this idea?
So I'm not sure. I think probably you misunderstood what I was trying to say. You asked me how we can explain the Gulf states' positioning and behavior with regards to the war in Ukraine. And for them, it's a matter of their economic self-interests. It's not a matter of, it's very directly linked to that. So their political behavior is very much explained by their economic self-interests.
Thank you very much. Before, sorry, Tom, just 1 second, please, Mr. Yes, sir. You have a quick remark? Mike?
Perhaps to complete what was said regarding the Saudi Arabia's behavior, posture towards the Ukrainian question, the Iranian factor is very important there. Iranian collaboration with Russia against Ukraine is also an element that the Saudi Arabia has to take.
And this is a very interesting subject, but this is outside the parameters of our session today. But I'm sure this is very interesting. We'll be tackling it in other sessions. And our next speaker is Mr. Tom Sanderson. His work is known for counterterrorism and extremism. He's currently a co-chair. He co-chairs the counselors program at the Atlantic Council, and he's a member of the advisory council on counterterrorism and extremism at the Middle East Institute. Please, our American guest always is a lightning rod. So, and I saw you nodding several times when the speakers were speaking. So please, you have you're the last speaker, so you have the privilege of answering any ideas that you disagree with. Please, go ahead.
And I see that I have 33 minutes to go for my remarks. That's
no,
very
not all for you. Not all for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Brahim Fasifiri for the invitation to return to the MEDays conference. For those of you who are thinking that the last speaker of the session is going to deliver the good news after hearing all the bad news, you should break for lunch now, because it's not going to be any good news for me. I was nodding, but I was also shaking my head at some of the answers. And let me just start with your final question for my friend and colleague, Anna. The reason that the Gulf is more oriented in the Russia-Ukraine conflict towards Russia is very simple. They have much more in common with Russia and much more to benefit from the Russians and the Ukrainians. The Russians in many of the Gulf states are authoritarian. They are energy focused. They have immense friction with the US from time to time, Russia more than the Gulf. There's a ton of Russian money in the Gulf, not a ton of Ukrainian money in the Gulf.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Tom. Do you think this is the only reason? Do you see who occupies the White House has a key?
That's part of it. They
it's
obviously
kind of a personal thing, maybe?
They see someone who's neutral, if not adversarial, in the White House today, as opposed to Trump, who was very, I would say, I won't say anything too nasty, but yeah, look, beyond accommodating, he was just in love with the Gulf and in love with the way that they exercise power, which he's jealous of. So let me start with my comments, and I'll try to cover some things that were not covered. What can we learn from the latest major events on the international scene? Well, let's talk about some of those events. Russia's brutal war against Ukraine, the ongoing war in the DRC, North Korea launching 24 missiles this week, China's National Party Congress crowning a new chairman Mao 2 weeks ago, and with everything that means under the leadership of Xi Jinping, global population about to hit 8 billion people on a planet with a finite amount of water, extreme heat records broken again, ISIS and Al-Qaeda continuing to live on, 55,000 wives and children in camps across Syria, 15,000 dead in the first 9 months across Africa, mostly in the Sahel and in the Horn of Africa, as a result of their activity. Afghanistan ruled again by the Taliban, and the United States, typically a stabilizing global force, heading towards intense political violence domestically. And the list goes on and does not end, basically. So the world is deconstructing in many places. Rule of law is dying. Respect for international borders continues to deteriorate. Disinformation is mainstreamed. Dishonesty is not challenged. Widely accepted facts are challenged. Democracy is in serious trouble. And without it, violent extremism is much harder to defeat, because without responsive, performing governance, militant groups offer an alternative. Okay, Ukraine. Most of the blame here goes to Vladimir Putin. There's no doubt about that. Yes, there are issues concerning NATO's expansion, but they are not a fundamental core threat to a country with 6,000 warheads, 9 time zones, and the largest combined fossil fuels in the world, coal, oil, and gas. When you have your friends and partners like Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi 7 weeks ago telling you in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, that they have concerns over your war in Ukraine, then you are clearly on the wrong side of things here. And where is the outrage, especially in the global south? Where was the outrage when Putin started blocking the grain shipments? Nothing. I heard nothing from the global south or from many other countries. Someone choking off the food supply, 50% of the world's sunflower oil, 15 to 20% of the wheat and barley. Dead silence. Afghanistan, an unmitigated disaster. There's no doubt about it. My colleague from the UK does point out some serious advances that were made and benefits accrued to those advances to women in education, but that is now frozen in place and likely to deteriorate. And top talent has left the country. Not all of it, but a lot of it has left. 20 years of fighting, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people dead, billions of dollars spent, and the result is the Taliban is in control again. President Biden's exit could hardly have been any worse. It could not have been worse. Now, Ghani asked him not to advertise the exit so that to prevent everyone from heading for the exits and even accelerating what we saw. President Biden was the last president holding the bag in Afghanistan. It was a consequence of mistakes throughout the 4 terms, the 4 presidents who were in control prior to that: Trump, Obama, and Bush, the 4th being Biden. So we failed to put a plan into action soon enough, but I'm not sure we could have had an effective plan. The deeply corrupt, incompetent government in Afghanistan deserves a lot of blame. Their leaders were spending much more time spiriting cases of US dollars out of the country into Dubai and into other places to buy their vacation homes instead of governing their own country. Mali, lots of people have addressed it, so I won't get too deep into it, but inviting the Wagner Group in to serve as your counterterrorism force after the departure of the highly imperfect but still effective on occasion French force is not a recipe for success. What are the new lines of force that structure the international scene? Ideology. They're not new, they're just exacerbated. Ideology, nationalism, brute force reigns supreme. They're not new. As I said, the rule of law and international norms ignored. The bifurcation of the U.S.-China and the European and China relationship is not good, but it is happening and it is underway. Climate change agreements, people signing up for them, no one complying with them. Just reported in the New York Times today, China produced more CO2 last year from coal than ever in their history. Okay, low quality, high sulfur, cheap coal. That's what keeps the now 3% growth per year economy going in China. How to strengthen the resilience of the international system? You start at the local level. Make sure your own house is in order. Transparency, corruption reduction. Those are pie in the sky hopes in much of the world, but that is a big part of the solution. I'm not hopeful, as you can tell, for the international system. Feel like we're moving ever closer to a disaster. The response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine shows one way in which the world has diverged. One part comes together to defy Russia, another part is completely silent or waffling on what happens because they fear Moscow, they benefit from Moscow, or they want the same options open to themselves. And I'll end there.
Thank you very much. Before I open the floor to your questions, I have a quick question to Mr. Sanderson, and maybe Mr. Ramel can also tackle it as well. We took it for granted, especially in the Western world, governments follow their interest, regardless who is on top of the government. Recently, for the past probably 10, 15 years, we see Western powers fluctuating depending on who occupies 10 Downing Street or the White House or what have you. From liberating Kuwait and stopping at the border to another president going all the way to Baghdad. From a president signing an Iranian nuclear deal to a president 4 years later tearing it apart. So do we expect more fluctuating? Is that conventional wisdom that Western powers follow their own interests? Every president has his own or her own interpretation of that interest at the time. Please, Mr. Sanderson, if you can comment on that, and after that, Mr. Ramel.
Well, in the U.S. power structure, the president does have responsibility and wide latitude in setting U.S. foreign policy. And it does reflect both the party in power, but also it reflects the interests of the nation. They used to say that foreign policy, or that domestic politics stopped at the water's edge during the Cold War, and that Democrats and Republicans came together when it came to the Soviet Union and other adversaries and problems globally. That is now not the case in the United States. Foreign policy is part of the political division that is so sharp in America today. And we also see that in Europe with the political divisions and the attitude towards the Chinese and towards the Russians.
The quick turnover that I'm talking about, Tom.
Yeah, the quick turnover is not helpful for those countries trying to make long-term plans, but the quick turnover in the past, prior to the last 10 years, did not mean wild swings in foreign policy. What we see from Trump to Biden on attitudes towards NATO, attitudes towards the Middle East are very, very sharp, and we did not see those swings from Bush to Obama. We did not see that from Clinton to Bush, and we did not see that from Bush 41 to Clinton. So,
thank you.
Yeah.
Well, please.
Just briefly, I think in both the United States and in the United Kingdom, there used to be much more common ground in terms of foreign policy between, for want of a better phrase, the right and the left. And that has dissipated, partly because of populism, partly, and I would say it as someone from the centre-left, partly because of the increased zealotry of the right in the US and the United Kingdom, in the Republican Party and in the Conservative Party in the UK. And I think the response to it has to be much stronger focus on evidence-based decision-making, much more seeking out of shared interest and attempting to tackle the polarisation, because it doesn't help anyone in the UK or the US, it doesn't help anyone in the rest of the world to see that polarisation and the fluctuations in where you're coming from internationally.
Thank you, Monsieur Flau.
Mais il y a énormément de choses qui ont été dites tout à l'heure, notamment la crise de la démocratie. C'est vous qui l'avez dit, notre ami des États-Unis. Parce que finalement, on peut s'interroger si aujourd'hui, il y a encore de la démocratie et si elle est encore capable de s'exprimer au travers des partis, qu'ils soient de gauche ou de droite. Puisque finalement, en de très nombreux endroits, on constate que les partis n'apportent plus de solutions aux problèmes quotidiens, concrets, que les gens ont. Et le problème, c'est quand il y a une expression de la démocratie, souvenez-vous de l'invasion du Capitole aux États-Unis. Observez le résultat très, très difficile au Brésil. Pensez au Sénégal, où Macky Sall n'a plus qu'un siège, et je crois qu'il a perdu dans sa majorité. Et dans d'autres endroits, chez nous aussi, lorsque les démocraties s'expriment, le vote n'étant pas obligatoire, sauf en Belgique où il est obligatoire, mais il est clair qu'il y a une émergence des extrêmes qui fait effectivement que, à la fois en interne de nos pays, mais aussi à l'extérieur, on arrive à des confrontations de blocs. ce qui se passe en Ukraine, c'est un Xème épisode de la guerre froide. Et finalement, c'est une opposition de bloc. Et demain, on aura l'opposition Russie-États-Unis, Russie-États-Unis-Chine. Et là encore, l'autre bloc du Sud, lui, il ne sera pas présent. Et l'Europe, elle, par sa division, ne constitue même plus aujourd'hui un bloc. Et puis, quelques autres éléments. Vous savez, on a eu une réaction rapide, très rapide, avec la crise bancaire. Là, on a rapidement trouvé des solutions entre les différents pays pour apporter des solutions aux banques qui étaient en crise. La population, c'est venu après, et elle subit encore des effets de cette crise bancaire. La crise des vaccins, parlons-en de la crise des vaccins. La Belgique est un des pays le plus gros producteur de vaccins au monde. Eh bien, on a libéré les vaccins produits en Belgique lorsque on avait la garantie que nos populations du Nord allaient pouvoir avoir ces vaccins, avant de les libérer vers le Sud et les autres endroits. Il a fallu des mois et des interpellations du Premier ministre. J'ai moi-même interpellé le Premier ministre de mon pays avant qu'il n'aille à la réunion européenne pour dire « Mais bon Dieu de bon sang, qu'attendez-vous pour exporter nos vaccins ?» On a dit non, il faut attendre de voir si on en aura suffisamment chez nous et puis on va... en gardant bien entendu nos brevets, parce qu'on ne va pas donner nos idées, à ces Africains, est-ce qu'ils seront capables de les utiliser? C'est ça le raisonnement, que l'on trouve aussi quelquefois en disposition de matériel militaire dans certains pays du Sahel, par exemple. On n'a pas donné l'accès à certains pays du Sahel à des méthodes modernes d'identification des mouvements de migration. C'est la réalité. Donc on attend, et puis on se sert d'abord et les autres après. Je crois qu'il y a un grand problème dans le monde d'aujourd'hui, c'est l'absence totale de solidarité. Et je crois que nous n'arriverons à reconstruire quelque chose que si on remet en avant-plan cette solidarité entre les peuples et pas la confrontation pour des intérêts économiques en fonction d'intérêts économiques et parfois de dirigeants qui s'opposent entre eux.
Thank you. Mr. Kazi, you wanted to say something? You wanted to say something?
Yeah. The question of, decision-making in Washington. I think the American political elite is living still in the 90s when the Cold War collapsed. But today, the world lives in new reality. It's a multipolar. With China, rising China, assertive Russia. They haven't reconciled to that. Now you see there was talk about the Saudi position. I think it's a remarkable thing. It is something very eye-opening for the US policymakers that an ally like Saudi Arabia could stand up and say, no, it has never happened. Young leadership has a new way of thinking and also is taking stock of the changes that has taken place in the global scene. Now, Saudi Arabia, of course, one version could be that it is commercial interest or economic interest. What about so many African countries, poor African countries? They voted in the United Nations General Assembly, abstained from voting, or, some even disappeared from the conference hall. They didn't support the resolution on Ukraine, repeated. And the International Human Rights Commission, it was terrible. It was 100 votes abstaining, 93 in favor, and these were all developing African countries. World has changed. I think people, these elites in US have to take stock of the new reality that have come up.
Thank you. Thank you. Before I open the floor to Q&As, I have a quick question for Mr. Yassar. I could not resist. The president of Turkey, President Erdogan, it seems he's enjoying being in the limelight again, getting the attention given the Ukrainian-Russian war. Where does he stand on these issues?
Of course, Turkey is
and I'm sorry, given how the Russian army is faring on the war, does Turkey still want to maintain the S-400? Are you still willing to fight with NATO to acquire the S-400?
Yes, S-400, but they are stored somewhere and locked, and it is not being used because Turkey cannot resist the pressure of the United States on this subject. But regarding to wider context of your question, Turkey is in NATO, but it's a special case of NATO because it was alienated by the United States on several issues, both in the past and also at present, for the F-400, F-35, and also F-16s. All these questions are pending somewhere, and we do not know what will be the final reaction and final decision of the United States. So Turkey wants to keep this position now that its relations with Putin is good. It wants to play this to its advantage and perhaps position Turkey in a place where it should be. I fear, as an Atlantist, because I worked for a long time in NATO infrastructures, both at headquarters and also in the central administration, Turkey's place is in the Western world, Euro-Atlantic place. To move towards Russia has risks because we are close to Russia, and there are Russian intentions on strategic intentions of Russia for the control of the Turkish Straits. All these things put together makes Turkey a very critical, puts Turkey in a very critical question. And I hope that the wisdom will prevail in Turkey, and Turkey will find its place in the Euro-Atlantic sphere.
Thank you very much. Now I would like to open the floor to question and answers. Please, I would ask each of you to state your name, affiliation, and no speeches or lectures. Question, please. Wait for the mic. Mic. Gentleman, right here in front, please. Please. And who do you want to reply, please?
Tout doucement. Merci, Monsieur le Président. Bien que je maîtrise le français, je préfère parler en arabe parce que nous sommes au Maroc et la langue officielle au Maroc, c'est l'arabe et l'amazigh.
Très bien.
بالنسبة لي موقف
الاسم الكريم لو سمحت ومين هيدي محاضرة ولا سؤال؟
لا ما ما تكلمتش.
لا سؤال.
من فضلك احترام القاعة.
الاحترام
من فضلك أنت لبناني.
احترام
أنت لبناني وعليك أن تسمع صوت المغرب في هذه القاعة.
رح تسمع، بس قل لي عندك سؤال ولا محاضرة؟
لا ما عنديش محاضرة.
ولا جاي عندك حالة شعبوية؟
لا ما عنديش.
جاي تعمل شعبوي ولا تعمل محاضرة؟
لا
لو سمحت احترم الموجودين واسألهم سؤال.
أنا أحترم الجميع وأنا أطرح سؤال.
طلبوا مني ذلك.
أنا أطرح سؤال.
لو سمحت.
احترم المتدخلين.
لو سمحت.
بالنسبة للعقوبات الاقتصادية ضد روسيا، ما هي تأثيرها على دول الجنوب، دول إفريقيا؟ ومع الأسف ليس هناك ممثل إفريقيا في المنصة للحديث عن مالي وعن دول الجنوب التي لم تصوت ضد أوكرانيا في الجمعية العامة للأمم المتحدة، ومنها المغرب لم يشارك في التصويت لأن لنا مصالح كذلك. كما للغرب له مصالح، المغرب له مصالح وله علاقات جيدة مع الولايات المتحدة
الأمريكية. ما هو السؤال لو سمحت؟
سؤالي وهو تأثير العقوبات الاقتصادية.
ومن تريد أن يجيب على السؤال؟
أنا أوجه السؤال للضيف الكريم من بلجيكا وأحييه على خطابه خطاب الحقيقة. شكرا.
شكرا لك.
Mais je vous remercie pour votre question. J'ai l'impression que dans les interventions, je n'ai pas été distrait de la situation des pays africains. Et j'ai surtout mis l'accent sur le fait que les politiques qui sont menées pour l'instant au nord ignorent superbement ce qui se passe au sud et les répercussions qui peuvent se produire pour les pays du sud. C'est tout à fait compréhensible que certains pays se soient abstenus au niveau des Nations Unies, puisque ce n'est pas votre guerre, disent-ils. Les intervenants disent ce n'est pas notre guerre, c'est une guerre qui est en Occident, mais que finalement, nous allons en subir les conséquences, sur le plan alimentaire notamment. Et donc, en clair, lorsque le sommet entre M. Michel et M. Macron s'est tenu, où il y avait des promesses pour 150 milliards d'euros, je vous dis que ma crainte, qui devait venir vers l'Afrique, ma crainte aujourd'hui, c'est que on va invoquer la nécessité de la reconstruction de l'Ukraine pour finalement peut-être détourner ces 150 milliards qui étaient destinés à l'Afrique vers l'Est de l'Europe, ce qui serait une nouvelle pénalisation de l'Afrique. Et donc je crois qu'il y a une compréhension à avoir par rapport aux pays africains qui se sont abstenus. Il y a effectivement une expression qui doit être donnée par les pays africains dans leur ensemble pour dire qu'ils existent et qu'ils n'entendent pas être les responsables, et que les sanctions, vous savez, elles touchent les populations aussi bien russes qu'ukrainiennes, elles touchent aussi la population de nos pays et de plus en plus, et vous voyez ce qui se passe en France avec des manifestations qui sont en train de se produire, et le problème c'est qu'il faudrait trouver rapidement une solution à l'arrêt de ce conflit, et là la Turquie a son rôle à jouer. Le conflit s'arrêtera quand les États-Unis auront décidé d'arrêter le conflit, et il faudra mettre autour de la table autre que les deux protagonistes. Il faudra entourer par une communauté internationale vraiment responsable pour ce problème concret, où il y aura des Africains, mais il y aura aussi des Chinois, parce que les Chinois ne vont pas bouger aussi longtemps que les États-Unis ne bougeront pas.
Thank you. Mr. Ramel, please.
Yes, Mr. Moderator, you encouraged us to state clearly when we disagree, because it makes for a better debate.
Please.
And I do disagree.
Music to me.
I do not think it's understandable that African nations abstained in response to what Putin did. This is the biggest act of aggression against a peaceful neighbour, and an unjustifiable aggression since the Second World War. And it's an existential threat to all of us. And yes, there is an impact of sanctions. If we want to resolve this peacefully through sanctions, there is an impact of sanctions in the global south. There's an impact of sanctions in the north as well. In a sense, we're all in this together, but unless we bring those pressures to bear on Russia to seek a change of direction and a change of policy, then I fear where this conflict will go.
Thank you. Tom, please.
The Russian invasion is the cancer. The sanctions are the chemotherapy. Yes, the chemotherapy is awful, but you got to focus on the cancer.
Thank you very much. Please, the gentleman here, your name, please, and your question.
To Mr. Ramel and Mr. Sanderson, one thing. My perspective is that this war highlights a clear cleavage fracture in Europe. We must talk at plurals, two Europes. The old continent, France, Germany, Spain and Italy, that have a more softer approach towards Russia. And a hard bone made by the eastern countries from the Baltic to the North Sea that are really, really hard against Russia. Do you think, am I right, and do you think this will mark these next decades? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Please.
If I go back to my time as a UK foreign minister, there were always tensions and differences of emphasis, particularly between the UK, France and Germany with regard to Russia. And bluntly, on all sides, that was often about self-interest. I think we're beyond the stage of jockeying for position and self-interest. What Putin is doing, the threat that he is presenting not only to Ukraine, but to the whole international community, does need tackling. And that means that we need to come at this together. Now, I wouldn't say at the moment that there's a huge gulf between the positions of France, Germany particularly, and the UK, even though we're no longer in the European Union. But we need to work at this together to put the pressure on together.
Thank you. Tom.
Well, France, Germany, and Italy have very deep and extensive economic ties with Russia. And it's not that those countries in the East do not, but it is very telling and very instructive that the most fierce and strongest reply to the Russian invasion in Ukraine comes from those who were repressed by the Russians and kept behind the Iron Curtain. That tells you a lot about where things are.
Thank you very much. Our last question, please. The gentleman over there, please. Thank you.
Merci. Merci. Je m'appelle Alassane Suleiman. Je suis journaliste. J'écris aussi des chroniques sur les questions un peu de diplomatie, de relations internationales. Et je viens du Mali. Et le Mali a été évoqué dans ce débat par les panélistes. Alors j'ai une question en deux à deux niveaux. La première question, c'est que je voudrais savoir si les panélistes partagent le fait qu'on a comme l'impression que en Occident, tout ce que la Russie fait est mauvais. Le micro, voilà. Donc, on a l'impression que tout ce que, et c'est une impression partagée un peu chez moi, tout ce que, du point de vue occidental, la Russie fait est mauvais. Donc, quand on parle de Wagner au Mali, alors que d'un point de vue officiel au Mali, il n'y a pas de Wagner.
Et la deuxième question?
Oui, il y a plutôt des instructeurs russes au Mali. La deuxième question, c'est qu'aujourd'hui, on parle beaucoup de Nouvel Ordre Mondial. Nouvel Ordre Mondial. Et aujourd'hui, du point de vue de la guerre entre la Russie et l'Ukraine, on a l'impression que la lecture, selon qu'on soit du monde occidental ou du reste du monde, est différente. Pour le reste du monde, qui n'est pas le monde occidental, c'est la Russie qui est provoquée. Et pour le monde occidental, c'est l'Ukraine qui est envahie. Est-ce que les panélistes partagent cela? Merci beaucoup.
Qui vous voulez répondre à la question?
Moi, je prends n'importe quelle réponse. Merci beaucoup.
Monsieur Fallot, s'il vous plaît.
Je suis proche de vous, c'est vrai. Tout d'abord, pour revenir sur la position de l'Europe, il y a toujours eu plusieurs Europes dans les réponses aux crises. On a parlé tout à l'heure de l'Afghanistan. J'ai cité l'exemple de la guerre en Irak. L'opposition à la guerre en Irak, à un certain moment, c'était la France, l'Allemagne, la Belgique et le Luxembourg, qui au sein de l'OTAN ont dit non, dans un premier temps, parce qu'il fallait une couverture de l'ONU. Donc je crois qu'aujourd'hui encore, effectivement, au niveau européen, avec la Grande-Bretagne dedans ou dehors, il y a aussi des positions différentes pour des raisons différentes. Et on va voir comment d'ailleurs l'Italie, qui vient de prendre un tournant dangereux sur le plan démocratique, mais c'est les électeurs italiens qui l'ont décidé, va évoluer dans ce différent conflit. En ce qui concerne le Mali, je crois qu'il faut effectivement considérer qu'il y a deux lectures, selon que l'on se trouve au nord et en occident ou que l'on se trouve au sud par rapport à la situation. J'ai dit tout à l'heure que beaucoup de dirigeants africains ont considéré que ce n'est pas leur guerre, mais ils sont conscients que c'est eux qui vont en souffrir et c'est ce que nous ne pouvons pas accepter. Et c'est pour ça qu'il faut se positionner clairement avec l'ensemble des acteurs et pas uniquement avec les protagonistes. Il faut élargir le débat en n'oubliant aucune partie du monde. Quant à la perception de Wagner, oui, c'est clair qu'il y a des troupes à certains endroits, depuis sans doute longtemps, qu'il y a des instructeurs depuis la période soviétique qui sont toujours là. Il suffit de voir les armements qui sont utilisés à certains moments. Le tout est de savoir aujourd'hui comment faire en sorte qu'on revienne dans des relations normales et pas avec des mercenaires, parce que c'est ça le danger.
Tom, you have quick remarks?
Sure, thank you. Anytime you bring in a private military corporation like Wagner or ones from any country, you're going to have problems because the accountability is not the same as when national forces from that particular country come in. Wagner's operations in CAR, Sudan, Mozambique, Libya, Burkina Faso, Mali. Tell me what good they have done. They come in, they pay bribes, commit human rights atrocities. The EU has investigated this, rapes, murders by these private military corporations. They are destroying UN communications equipment in the car. This is the Wagner Group. They are trading executive or official leader protection for diamonds and gold. Does that sound like a long-term solution? Now, the French operation was not great, but in places effective. But the Wagner Group is not a force for good. Yes, many senior military officers in Mali got their military training and education in Russia. I understand those ties, but this is a short-term high from a drug that will not do the nation any good.
Thank you. We approached our last minute, but I'm going to ask the organizer to give us 3 more minutes, please. We outlined all the crises, and we had a tall order, and what did we learn, and what we have not learned, if we had learned anything. I would ask each one of you, please, in 1 minute, what's next? Have we learned anything? Just quick remarks, each one of you. What do you recommend? What should we anticipate instead of quarterbacking and saying what happened? And please, starting with you, Tom, please.
What should we expect? More of the same. I don't see any major divergence here. We're in the midst of wars worldwide. Transparency is low. There's a democratic deficit. Disinformation rules the day. I don't see things getting better.
Anna?
I agree with Tom, but I also like to kind of have a more positive outlook. I mean, the only way we can start to deal with crisis globally is to increase communication and try. It's about perceptions, and I think the gentleman who posed a question of, are we right to think that Russia is aggressed and not the aggressor? All of these things are influencing our way of making effective policies. So we need to start to do that.
Thank you. Mr. Yassar, please. Mike?
There's a different solution for each case we are talking about. On Mali, I think what we need is the long-term solution that stretches decades and solves the question rather than the urgent question that could be solved in a week's time.
Thank you.
In Russia, Russia has to be stopped expanding, otherwise it will go back to the Soviet Union time. In Afghanistan, the Taliban has to be assisted, helped to overcome its problem rather than alienating them.
That's a nice segue to Mr. Kazi. Thank you.
Actually, I don't see the logic of having Ukraine and having to push Ukraine to join NATO. NATO is not an innocent organization. It's a military defense, and it had its role in Afghanistan, it had its role in Iraq, it had role in conflicts other places. So, I mean, why carry the conflict to the borders of a country which is largest geographically in the world and has very largest, and also has the largest nuclear arsenal?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Kazi. Mr. Ramo?
Just picking up that last point, I wouldn't support Ukraine joining NATO because of, the founding principle of NATO that we each defend each other. Just think the logic of that through, it would leave us in a very difficult and invidious position. What do we expect? I'm very fearful about what we expect. I don't think all of these issues we're talking about are necessarily as linked as we are suggesting. I think the preeminent challenge is what Russia is doing and what is happening in Ukraine. We need greater communication, greater collaboration, greater common ground across the globe between everyone. And I would just say that I think in respect of Russian actions in Ukraine, they are more aggressive, they are more unjustifiable than many of the acts that took place by the Soviet Union during the Cold War. That's the degree of seriousness and challenge that we are facing, and I think collectively we need to face.
Thank you. Thank you very much. 30 secondes, s'il vous plaît.
Eh bien, il y a simplement, il faut un sursaut pour la paix partout. On a beaucoup parlé de l'Ukraine. J'ai commencé, moi, à parler aussi des conflits oubliés, aussi bien à l'est du Congo qu'en Israël et en Palestine. Et il faut que cette communauté internationale, au travers de ces États, avec des démocraties revigorées, recertifiées, qui associent les citoyens, réellement, que cette communauté se mobilise sérieusement pour apporter une réponse urgente dans les conflits existants. Et ça, on n'y arrivera plus avec les instances actuelles. Il faut que les États prennent leurs responsabilités avec leurs armées, parce que Wagner est dangereux, mais Blackwater était dangereux aussi au niveau du conflit en Afghanistan et en Irak. Et donc, oui, en toute transparence, avec les États responsables, des responsables démocratiquement élus qui prennent leurs responsabilités et qui font passer les intérêts de la paix avant les intérêts économiques ou de stratégie militaire.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our panelists for their insights, and thank you for attending. Thank you.